Hello everyone, how's it going? Well, this is another one of these patron request videos. I'm trying to get a lot of them out over the next couple of weeks so that I can kind of return also to just my own topical videos of subjects that I want to share. So, for those of you who don't know, if you become a patron of mine, patreon.com/classicaltheist, you can request that I do a video of a topic of your choice, so long as it basically pertains to theology or philosophy or some such related topic. And I'll do that for you, or it can be reacting to a stream, responding to content, be that whatever is on your mind. So this topic is pretty interesting. I find it pretty interesting. It basically has to do with what is basically my take on Richard Ibranyi and the Mary's Little Remnant sect. I'm sure most of you have no idea what that is, but I think it's interesting. It's one of these more extreme sects of Sedevacantism. You have some very fringe Sedevacantist groups. I mean, you have, I don't know how many of you know about the Palmarian Church. That's a whole other can of worms. I'm not going to get into them here. But you also have Mary's Little Remnant. I think one of the most interesting Sedevacantist groups, just because of the uniqueness of their position, right? And we'll get into that here. But, I do remember a long time ago, while I was myself trying to find my fitting as a Catholic, at this point, very much immersed in the whole traditionalist landscape, and throughout this whole period of time, the horror of Sedevacantism had always loomed over me a bit. And now, I knew very instinctively at the time that if Sedevacantism in general were true, if its premises were true, that it would not only make living out my faith rather depressing and bleak, given the apparent absence of the Holy Spirit and 99% of institutional Catholicism, but it would also make it a lot harder for me to retain faith in the veracity of Catholic claims. So I always saw Sedevacantism, therefore, as on some level a subtle contravention of the divine promise that the gates of hell would not prevail over the church. Ironically, I actually always agreed with Pope Michael, of all people, that essentially the perpetuity of Petrine succession was absolutely necessary in order for the church's apostolicity to remain fully active throughout the ages. And while at the time I would say, much more firmly planted in, the whole SSPX mindset of how to evaluate Vatican II and its aftermath and the liturgy, I still believed that Sedevacantism was definitely a bridge too far. And yet that same SSPX mentality that I had always led me constantly worried about it being true. And that's because at the time, while I accepted the legitimacy of the post-conciliar pontificates, I was pretty convinced that these were just heretics, basically, who hadn't yet been deposed by the church per Cajetan's thesis on what to do with the heretical pope. Now, needless to say, I no longer hold those views. I think a lot of you know precisely where I stand now. And, since abandoning them, the fear of Sedevacantism for me has basically evanesced completely with that abandonment. But when I did hold them, the fear of Sedevacantism, it always loomed, as I said, and this actually ended up worsening when I had discovered the infamous Richard Ibranyi of what's called Mary's Little Remnant. So in response to this patron's request, I will go into some detail about Ibranyi's school of Sedevacantism, what I think about it, and why I actually think that this brand of Sedevacantism is, on some level, the most honest expression of it. And I think its existence serves as a pretty decent, though not absolute, but it contributes, I think, to the reductio ad absurdum against the foundational premise that underlies the Sedevacantist thesis. So first things first, who is Richard Ibranyi, and how can we go about characterizing his brand of Sedevacantism? Well, Richard Ibranyi actually used to be a member of Most Holy Family Monastery, but eventually he had a falling out with them. And one of the reasons, there were a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was because he began to see the fundamental errors of what he considered like the conciliar church. He saw those errors were still on some level retained in the thinking of mainline Sedevacantists. And so he took his, feeneyitism to essentially the furthest lengths or the farthest limits of its logical entailments. And feeneyitism, by the way, is this view, it's this very rigid interpretation of the view that outside the church there's no salvation. And they apply that principle specifically to the necessity of water baptism, that there's no such thing as baptism of desire, and that there's no such thing as having some invisible link to the communion of the church. Essentially, they think that the idea of invincible ignorance is not a legitimate pathway toward having any union with the church. And we'll get into why this leads into his unique Sedevacantist stance, but just for the sake of expelling this, baptism of desire is affirmed. It goes all the way back, to the early church. Pope Innocent III, by the way, explicitly teaches it when he speaks of faith in the sacrament sufficing for the sacrament of faith. And I think that's actually partly why Richard Ibranyi takes the extreme stance that he does. And so what is that stance? Well, over time, he began to realize that the doctrinal issues that he was hung up on, namely this feeneyitism, had origins that were far more entrenched in the history of the church, so much so that if he were to be consistent in holding to this foundational premise of Sedevacantism in particular, then he would simply need to accept whatever results ensue from applying that premise to previous claimants of the papal throne, no matter how far back into church history you have to go. And to my astonishment, that's exactly what he did. He discovered, for example, that the doctrinal hang-ups of most Holy Family monasteries' brand of Sedevacantism, namely feeneyitism, and kind of their overly simplistic conception of what is meant by the church and the boundaries of the church, the doctrines that they regard as heretical pertaining to those teachings have their origins that go back much further than the death of Pius XII. In fact, according to Abani, they ultimately go back to the advent of the High Middle Ages. And I think he's actually right about that in terms of his, the teachings that undermine his rigid interpretation of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. I do agree with him. They do go back much farther into church history. But last I checked, I think he believes that the last validly elective pope was Innocent II. And as a result of all this, all popes since then, and all bishops since then, have received their offices and their orders invalidly. And so this means that for Ibranyi, the Catholic priesthood itself has been extinct, and therefore it's impossible for the holy sacrifice of the Mass to ever be celebrated. In fact, he sees that as like a sign of reprobation if you attend Mass, because he regards that as no longer able to be celebrated. Now, he even goes so far as to condemn the staples, I would say, of Western spirituality itself and Western theology, such as scholasticism, the Western tradition's brand of sacred art, Thomistic theology, etc. In fact, he goes so far as to say that he famously describes in graphic detail a hopeful vision of his of one day seeing St. Thomas Aquinas being roasted in hell, basically rotisserie style. It's pretty gruesome stuff. And he sees scholasticism itself as a fundamental heresy that has infected the church and is at the root of the perceived errors that he sees, such as, invincible ignorance and the like. No doubt due to scholasticism's insistence on nuance and intellectual precision when it comes to analyzing and interpreting received Catholic dogmas. And it's the precision and the nuance, the intellectual precision, I think, that is actually the culprit for articulating these dogmas of the church, allowing for the various distinctions that we allow for. So I don't think it has to do with heresy that we end up with the more clarified interpretation of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. I mean, it just has to do with making use of the intellect to further refine the received dogmas, according to development of doctrine that St. Vincent of Lerins talked about. Now, of course, to most of us, this proposition of his seems obviously insane. It's an obviously insane conclusion, and by itself, if it were true, it would be a sign that either Catholicism is just false, or so that is if it's true, or we could lead to the conclusion that some premise along the way toward this conclusion would just have to be abandoned by virtue of the absurd logical entailment that we see. And I think you would be correct about that, right? Taking that interpretation of it. And that's because it's my contention that some of these premises along the way simply are just constitutive of mainline Sedevacantism itself. So I think that if you're going to root out the error that underlies Ibranyi's thesis, I think you would ultimately have to chuck out one of the constitutive premises of mainline Sedevacantism. Namely, specifically, I think the very idea that a pope would just lose his office by falling into some teaching that we privately determined to be heretical, I think that ultimately makes Ibranyi's thesis, at the very least, logically possible and internally coherent. For example, let's set aside Ibranyi's extreme application of this principle for the moment and zero in a bit on a scenario that might be more possible or plausible, yet would be considered off the table for most Sedevacantists. So let's say that you reject, or that rather, not only do you reject the licit use of natural family planning as, say, taught in Humanae Vitae under Paul VI, which most of them do, but you also reject the underlying moral principle that, in my view, is at least what logically allows for Paul VI's teaching on NFP. And that is the idea that it's licit to knowingly make use of non-fertile times for the performance of the marriage act in order to avoid the outcome of pregnancy. That principle in itself is conceded by most Sedevacantists and, of course, by previous popes. It's explicitly allowed for example, under the Holy Office of Leo XIII, and it's given papal ratification explicitly by Pius XI in his landmark encyclical of Casti Connubii. And as I said, most mainline Sedevacantists, they don't object to this so much as they object to the use of natural family planning as a more specific application of that principle. In my view, their acceptance of the former but not the latter, I think, is logically inconsistent. So let's say that a Sedevacantist is logically consistent, and therefore he sees the Leonine Holy Office's embrace of this more fundamental moral principle as tantamount to heresy, and not just NFP. Let's take it a step further. Let's say that they see this embrace of this principle as fundamentally rooted in scholastic philosophy's embrace of, Aristotelian anthropology, which has been effectively, sanctioned by the Church's canonization of St. Thomas Aquinas. We can get into how the relationship between those two things at some other time, maybe, but let's say they were to go all the way with that. And so in order to still remain consistent, that Sedevacantist in question would need to trace the cutoff point all the way back to, say, Pope John the 22nd in the 14th century, who canonized St. Thomas and allowed for the flourishing of scholasticism, etc., and the embrace of Aristotle. Now, if a mainline Sedevacantist sees this as insane, they will need to argue with this other Sedevacantist on the basis of argumentation that's outside the realm of ecclesiology. And so, in so doing, they have basically, in my view, if you take this view, and if you take Richard Ibranyi's conclusion seriously as a logical possibility that flows from the mainline Sedevacantist thesis, I think it does end up undermining the dogma of papal infallibility itself and the papacy itself. So why do I say that? Well, because the dogma of papal infallibility is essentially supposed to guarantee the faithful's assent to the deposit of faith, then if the continued validity of a pope's office is contingent upon his non-embrace of a given heresy, a given material heresy, then if a pope attempts an infallible teaching, which usually is taught to end some theological controversy to begin with, then all a dissenter really has to do on this Sedevacantist logic is to just disagree with the definition on the grounds that it contradicts some other perceived infallible rule of faith. And on that basis, they can just declare him to be an anti-pope. And so the dogma's operative efficacy, of papal infallibility is on some level, therefore, grounded upon a reception theory of ecclesiastical infallibility. And I would say, therefore, by that very fact, would undermine the dogma itself. Whereas, if you take the view that a pope does not automatically lose his office for the embrace of a heresy, then we simply must believe that the Holy Spirit would prevent heresy from intermingling with the pope's exercise of the infallible magisterium while we await the deposition of the pope, according to, again, Cajetan's thesis. Now, this not only safeguards the dogma of infallibility, but it also ensures that Ibranyi's thesis is theologically impossible in a way that mainline Sedevacantism is unable to do. And while I'm sure that most of you have never felt plagued by Ibranyi's thesis in particular, I do think that, this was a good opportunity to approach one of the more foundational errors of Sedevacantism from a bit of a unique vantage point. I think that what Ibranyi's thesis shows is that precisely because it cannot be theologically ruled out by mainline Sedevacantism, then there's really nothing that in an absolute sense would prevent Sedevacantism from evolving into, some form of de facto Western Orthodoxy, essentially, whereby, the liturgical and doctrinal inheritance of Roman Catholicism and Western liturgy and Western theology just becomes frozen in time and sterile and without active apostolic authority being used in the real world, and therefore it would lose its relevance, and essentially it loses its living ecclesiastical order. That's what I think is always on the table for a Sedevacantist thesis. So I hope this was an interesting video. I hope it gave you some insights to think about, and as far as how it relates to Sedevacantism. And I'll see you in the next one. God bless you.